Hello, everyone, and welcome to our study of Genesis chapter 29. Sometimes I find it funny the way that some couples meet for the first time and end up married. Now, TV shows like the Hallmark Channel and all of that, they'll lead you to believe that everything has to be picture perfect and the circumstances are always so extravagantly romantic with rose petals everywhere and all of this stuff. Well, I assume because I really avoid that channel. Now, we grew up listening to classic tales and children's movies and stuff like that about how romantic the first meeting of some couples are and the great lengths that they go to in order to win the heart of the person that they have fallen for. Now, in the end, the flowers are blooming, the birds are singing, and especially on Disney movies, even the wild animals are dancing around in celebration. Myself, I would find that creepy, but everybody always lives happily ever after. Maybe it's just because I'm male, but those kinds of stories honestly really just nauseate me. What I am interested in are the real couples, those that have the most awkward meetings, and then love bloomed in the unlikeliest of circumstances. When everything gone wrong, things turned out right for them. If you've ever watched that old television show MASH, you know who Alan Alda is. He met his wife Arlene at a dinner party when a rum cake had fallen onto the floor. They were the only two guests that happily ate the ruined cake off of the floor. The singer Dolly Parton said that she had met her future husband when he had hollered at her in a laundromat. So within a week, she had met his parents. Now, in today's study, we're going to look at how Jacob meets the love of his life, Rachel. And in the context of their time and culture, this is really a romantic meeting, and it's most definitely one that was ordained by God. But looking at this from the perspective of our day and age, and these things seem awkward and downright hilarious. I always laugh whenever I read these verses we're covering today. So if you happen to have a rather embarrassing story about how you met your spouse, maybe this study will make you feel better about your first meeting with your mate. And in fact, why don't you just go ahead and drop in the comments your stories, your awkward stories about how you met your husband or how you met your wife or boyfriend or girlfriend, and because I'd like to hear that. And maybe somebody else would feel better about their awkward encounter whenever they read your account. So I feel the need to limit our time of study today to just the first 20 verses of this chapter, because after that, things become a great big mess in Jacob's life. And things don't go as planned. His life gets turned upside down. And there's going to be some things that we're going to spend a little bit more time on to fully understand and comprehend what's going on. So the first half of this chapter could be picked up by places like the Hallmark chapter, but the last half would be more appropriate for a daytime talk show such as Jerry Springer, because it's going to be nothing but chaos. So in Genesis 29, let us begin this study with the first 3 verses. Then Jacob went on his journey and came to the land of the sons of the east. He looked and saw a well in the field, and behold, 3 flocks of sheep were lying there beside it, for from that well they watered the flocks. Now the stone in the mouth of the well was large. When all of the flocks were gathered there, they would then roll the stone from the mouth of the well and water the sheep, and put the stone back in its place on the mouth of the well. Verse 1 there just covers a very lengthy period of time with just a handful of words. And I bet Jacob wishes he could have sped through that part of this journey just as fast as we read about it. Jacob had fled home under the pretense of following his parents' orders to find a wife from their homeland. That's indeed one of the reasons he was on this journey. The other was that he was actually on the run from his brother Esau, who had just vowed to kill him. Jacob had gone about a 3-day journey from home when he had an encounter with the Lord in a place called Bethel. He was basically still just beginning this long trek to the land of Haran, because there were many more weeks of grueling travel. And I say this journey was grueling because there's no mention of Jacob ever taking any camels and stopping to water any camels on his journey. The Bible is clear that he has camels when he returns from Haran later with his family, but many people believe that he had made this initial journey on foot. Now, we don't know for sure, but only that the Bible mentions it when someone is sent away on a camel with provisions. And in this case, there is no mention. He had to use a rock for a pillow previously, so he wasn't very well prepared, to say the least. So in verse 2, he arrived at a well. Some scholars say this is likely the same well that the servant of Abraham found Rebekah, Jacob's mother, at. And we're going to see in a few verses that he is in the same vicinity. He just doesn't realize it. So it very well could be that well. Okay, I didn't mean for that to be a pun. It is indeed the same well, or if it is indeed the same well, there have been some changes. As this one, it's covered by a large rock. In the account of his mother Rebekah and the meeting at the well, there was no mention of a cover. So it's possible that people eventually saw the need to make this thing a little bit safer. After all, a great amount of time has passed. Now, his father Isaac was 40 when he married his mother, and his father was 60 when him and his brother were born. So that's 20 years. Now, according to some scholars, Jacob and Esau were in their mid-70s when this whole birthright thing went down. So we're looking at quite a time gap, at least 90 to 100 years since we last read anything about the land of Haran. You know, every day it seems like items we use are changed for safety. They're not the same as they were when we were young. Thanks to child safety protocol, you now have to have a master's degree in engineering just to operate a lighter to light a candle. Safety measures have been added to so many things that simply weren't there because in our day people were expected to have common sense and not hurt themselves. Don't even get me started on all of the warning labels these days. But I can understand needing to cover a well. I mean, we're used to picturing a well in our minds as having a little round structure surrounding it, 2 or 3 feet high, like a wishing well. Maybe had a little roof over it and a crank handle and a rope with a bucket on it. The wells in those days were simply a large hole that was dug in the ground, and there was no signs, no borders around it, anything to indicate that there was a well there. So it would be easy for an out-of-town traveler or an animal not paying attention to fall into one. I heard about 2 young boys that were walking out in the country, and they happened to find a giant hole in the ground, like a well. They looked inside and they couldn't see the bottom, and they're just wondering how deep this thing was. One of them picked up a stick and threw it in the well, and after a couple seconds it vanished from sight, and they never heard it hit bottom. Another boy found a large rock, and he heaved it into the opening, and they both sat there for over a minute and never heard a splash of water and never heard a thump of the rock hitting the bottom. So they decided there's a very large log over there in the nearby tall grass, and if both of them grabbed an end and threw it in there, surely it would make some kind of a noise. So they managed to drag this log over there, one on each end, and they threw it into the mouth of the well, and they stood there and watched it disappear. Now, as they're leaning over and watching in amazement as this log never hits the bottom of the hole, there's this crazy goat that just runs right between them and is like, blah, and just jumps right off into the hole. And they're standing there scratching their heads, trying to figure out what in the world is going on. And a farmer approached them and says, hey, have you boys seen a goat around here? And they said, yeah, she just ran right between us and jumped off into this big well right here. And the farmer says, oh, that's impossible. I had her tied up to a big old log over there in the grass. So you can see the importance of putting a lid on something like this, especially around sheep. Sheep are not the brightest animals. They wouldn't need the help of 2 curious boys to end up in the bottom of this well. So the locals decided to cover it with a very large stone. Now, verse 2 includes that detail, that this was a big rock that we're dealing with here. Now, verse 3 tells us that many shepherds used this same well to water their flocks. We know from the following verses that they usually watered them in the evenings after they had been led to graze on grass during the daytime. They would be thirstiest after eating the dry and dusty grass and all the shrubs in the field. But there were 3 separate flocks and shepherds who were already at this well in the middle of the day. And it seemed strange to Jacob that they would be there at this time, but at least there's someone he could ask, where am I? Because Jacob really had no idea. Let's go on into verses 4 through 6. Jacob said to them, my brothers, where are you from? And they said, we are from Haran. He said to them, do you know Laban, the son of Nahor? And they said, we know him. And he said to them, is it well with him? And they said, it is well, and here is Rachel, his daughter, coming with the sheep. I apologize for laughing as I was reading through verse 5 because I've studied on ahead a few chapters and I know the shady character that Laban turns out to be. And I just now realized that these men that Jacob is talking to here realize the kind of character that Laban is as well. Because when he asked them, "Do you know Laban?" That's why I read it in that tone. "Oh, we know him." I remember traveling with my family when I was a kid. We lived in Wyoming at the time, and we would travel to Oklahoma, where I now live, to see family. We would travel to Michigan to see my aunt. We would travel to Indiana to meet other relatives, and we'd go all of these places. And I was a kid, I was fascinated with the giant road atlas, had maps of all the states and all of the towns and all of these things. And that's what my dad used to navigate places we'd never been before. Today, you just tell someone to send me a pin on my phone with your location, and it gives you detailed directions, estimated time of arrival, alternate routes, and even more. I was making a delivery at work a few weeks ago, and I was using my phone for directions because I wasn't sure how to get to this job site. As I was driving through town, the voice on my phone told me that there's a reported speed trap up ahead on the highway. And I'm like, is this even legal? Because some states won't even let you have a radar detector. I can't help but think of in the days before road atlases were made. I mean, people would navigate using road signs. They would know where they were by seeing what town was coming up ahead and how far it was to the next 3 cities. They would always have multiple towns on there. Highways and interstates are numbered, and even smaller roads are named so that you can find your way around. But Jacob had none of that. Jacob never saw a sign that says Damascus, 52 miles. He never saw a sign that says last rest stop for 9 days. Not even a road name, just a well-worn path that a lot of travelers used. But Jacob was told that God would be with him on this journey. And as he stopped in the middle of nowhere, without even a clue as to where he was, could you imagine the relief in his heart when he heard these boys say, Haran? He had made it. God had led him to the right place. He had even led him to some people who knew the person in particular that he was told to find. So how is that for divine providence? God told him he would be with him. So it ended up in the right area. He'd ask him in verse 5, "Do you know Laban, the son of Nahor?" Actually, Nahor was the father of Bethuel, who is the father of Laban. Laban is the grandson of Nahor, but they used the same word for son as they did for grandson. Jacob understood that it had been 90 years or more since his mother had left this land. There was a possibility that Laban would no longer be among the living. So he delicately asked them in verse 6, is it well with him? Back in those days, before telecommunications and telephones and telegrams, people would tell a woman. Okay, I'm being silly, but word of mouth and a courier was the only way to get news and events concerning distant relatives. In Genesis 22, it was a courier that brought the news to Abraham that Nahor had fathered many children and was doing quite well. I can only imagine the cost of sending a messenger way back then. Could you imagine the difficulty of finding the person that was to receive it? You're going to give this message to a man named Abraham. You will find him 900 miles across the desert, but he'll be an old man living in a tent. Well, everybody's old man living in tents in the desert. Jacob had no idea if his uncle, whom he had never even met, was still alive. We have no record of them ever hearing from Rebekah either. Laban had never heard from Rebekah. Rebekah had never corresponded back after she departed from there nearly a century earlier. So Rebekah just assumed that her brother was still alive. Not only did these young men know of Laban and his well-being, they also knew his daughter, who just happened to be coming to the well as they spoke. I mean, isn't God amazing the way that he sets all of this up? The common practice in those days was to have the young kids take on the responsibility of the sheep. So those in charge of the 3 flocks that Jacob was talking to were probably not grown men. They were probably teens or even younger. What strikes me is that Rachel just happens to be a shepherdess. If she was as beautiful as Scripture makes her out to be, you would think that it would be dangerous to have her out there by herself, surrounded by all of these adolescent boys boys and strange travelers with no supervision. But it was a different world than it is today, for sure. I won't even let my kids roam as far as I did or stay out as long as I did when I was young. When I was young, I was gone from sun up to sunset, and sometimes I even had no idea where I was. In fact, there were several times that my parents even told me to go play in the traffic on more than one occasion. But yet Rachel was given the responsibility over Laban's flock of sheep, and here we see her working hard, just as her Aunt Rebecca had done when she was living there and around the same age that Rachel was at this time. We know that Laban also had sons. The scripture focuses mostly on his two daughters in the following verses and chapters, but we know of at least one son named Beor. Now, after doing some digging, there's an ancient text called, and I know I'm going to mess this up, the Sefer HaYashar, and it claims that Laban had three sons named Beor, Alub, and Merash. Now, one can't help but wonder if maybe they were older than Rachel, so they had more important responsibilities than tending the sheep. Therefore, the task fell to this daughter. Let's go ahead and get verses 7 through 12. He said, "Behold, it is still high day. It is not time for the livestock to be gathered. Water the sheep and go pasture them." But they said, "We cannot until all the flocks are gathered." And they rolled a stone from the mouth of the well. "Then we will water the sheep." While he was still speaking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess. When Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, Jacob went up and rolled the stone from the mouth of the well and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and lifted up his voice and wept. Jacob told Rachel that he was a relative of her father and that he was Rebekah's son, and she ran and told her father. As Rachel is approaching, Jacob starts to rebuke these guys who were there with their flock. It's around noon. They should have been leading the flock to some place where they could graze. This further shows us that these guys must have been very young. Jacob, being a stranger in this land, would not address adult men in the manner that he addressed these boys. He called them out on their laziness for lingering around this well early instead of being out doing their job. I worked at a shop in Florida one time that required you to clock in and out at the beginning and the end of every day. About 20 minutes before quitting time, some guys would just stand there, holding their time cards in their hand by the time clock, waiting until it said 5 o'clock so then they could punch out and go home. This is what these guys were doing. They're just waiting there half the day so they could be first in line to water their flock and then go on home and have the day over with. In verse 7, Jacob told them, said, "Water them and then go." In other words, get back to work. I don't think he was really as concerned with their work ethic, though, as it may seem. He has another motive. Perhaps he just wanted them to scram so he can talk to Rachel alone. Verse 8 also shows us how young they were, because it says they couldn't until someone moved the stone for them. We're already told that this stone is pretty large. We got to be careful not to make too much out of this, though. Some will say, "Oh, it was so massive that this was a miracle for Jacob to be able to move it." This is Jacob that we're talking about. This isn't Samson. It was heavy enough that these three lads, assuming there were three because of the number of the flocks that they were keeping, it must have been heavy enough that those three could not move the stone themselves. Or maybe they're just like some modern teens that give the same excuse when you tell them to do something. "I can't carry in groceries. They're too heavy. I can't carry my dirty clothes all the way to the laundry basket. They're too heavy. I can't take my trash can, take trash to the trash can, so I'll just throw it on the floor. It's all too heavy." Have you ever just gotten so mad at the excuses of others, you found it easier just to get in there and do the job yourself rather than listening to other people whine and make excuses? This is what Jacob did there in verse 10. Now, there are a lot of different things going on here. First, he's got to get rid of these lazy guys. In verses 9 and 10, he saw Rachel getting closer and closer, and these guys are going to crimp his style. So he grabbed this massive stone and did it himself, leaving them with no excuse. Now they can water their sheep and get out of there. Second, he sees a pretty girl coming his way and an opportunity to impress her. So he decides to appear all macho and does what is probably the first manly thing that Jacob has ever done in his sheltered life. And I bet even Esau would have been proud of his little brother for once. Isn't it funny how most of us men will do stupid things to impress a woman? We will lift something bigger than we should and we'll act like it's nothing, and then we'll go around the corner and we'll cry about our back hurting. Some men will change their posture and suck in their stomach when a pretty girl passes by, trying to look better. But the same things happen in the animal kingdom too. Males will strut and do silly things for a potential mate. But there is something else that I want us to notice. This is exactly the opposite of the scene where his mother met Abraham's servant, where Rebekah met Abraham's servant. Commentators speak about the similarities of these two encounters, but I see a big difference. The last time it was Rebekah who had drawn more than a ton of water to give to the servant's camels that were with him. She worked extremely hard for a stranger that she didn't even know. In verse 10, it's Jacob doing all of the heavy work, and then he proceeded to water the flocks that she was tending. Jacob was taking on the role of a servant instead of the privileged son of a wealthy man. Now, this is where the difference in our cultures and those times make this scene entirely different in meaning. Up until now, Jacob's on a roll. He made those young guys look like weaklings. He just showed off his strength and moved that rock by himself. And don't you know, he made sure he was flexing his muscles at just the right angle for Rachel to see. Now, keep in mind that he's getting up there in years. Jacob is no spring chicken, but he has grown darker from his journey in the sun on the way here. He just pulled off this super impressive feat of strength. And then in verse 11 says he kissed her. Now, here lies the difference in the cultures. Difference number one. This was a kiss of greeting between friends and family. People in the early church used to greet one another with a holy kiss. This was not the Hollywood movie first kiss where bells were ringing and birds are singing and there's a big orchestra following them around in the background. More than likely, this was just a customary peck on the cheek, like a greeting. But reading this from our vantage point and our social customs, verses 11 and 12 are hilarious. Here's a guy, he works hard to impress the girl. He boldly kisses her, then he starts crying. Ladies, what would your impression be if this happened to you when you're walking down the sidewalk? Some guy that you have never seen before does some feat of strength, and it's really impressive for an older guy. Then he kisses you, then he starts bawling and sobbing words that you can't understand. That kind of ruins the moment, doesn't it? And now here, I would picture Esau falling on the floor if he had been there to see this. Way to go, baby brother. That was really smooth. Then in verse 12, it says, she ran away. Good job, buddy. You blew it. She's going to go tell her dad what you just did. Actually, in their culture, he had greeted her warmly. He introduced himself as a relative of the family, and he became overwhelmed at how God had blessed him so far on this journey that had caused him so much anxiety before. And her running to her father was exactly the same response that Rebekah had done, if you remember. Back in Genesis 24, verse 28, it says, then the girl ran and told her mother's household about these things. That was what Rebekah did. So Rachel was simply getting the family ready to receive a guest with this warm welcome and a show of hospitality. That was their custom. But you've got to admit, it sounds hilarious when you read it in our lifetime. By the way, did you notice how she just ran off and kind of left Jacob in charge of all of these sheep without even asking him? Could you imagine what's going through his mind? Boy, not only did I mess that up, what's going to happen if I'm found with all of these sheep that don't belong to me? Let us go on into verses 13 through 20. So when Laban heard the news of Jacob, his sister's son, he ran to meet him and embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his house. Then he related to Laban all these things. Laban said to him, "Surely you are my bone and my flesh," and he stayed with him a month. Then Laban said to Jacob, "Because you are my relative, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what shall your wages be?" Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. And Leah's eyes were weak, but Rachel was beautiful of form and face. Now Jacob loved Rachel, so he said, "I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel." Laban said, "It is better that I give her to you than to give her to another man. Stay with me." So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of his love for her. Verse 13 shows us a nearly identical account of what happened with the servant of Abraham years ago. Laban was eager to greet him too. Of course, he saw all of these camels and a pretty good idea of the wealth that was behind his last visitor. But here stands Jacob, a man with nothing to offer. There's no camels, no gifts of gold, no silver for a dowry, no fancy garments to give anybody, just a man with a strong back and a kind heart, and a story to tell. I wondered when he related these things to Laban, as verse 13 said, if he left out the part about lying to his dad, deceiving his family, and being on the run from a brother who wanted to kill him. That might have been part of the story we leave out. According to verse 14, a month passes. Laban has shown hospitality to Jacob, not just because it was a custom in their culture, but this is also a family member. This is the son of his sister. But after some time, having company ceases to be as pleasant as the day of their arrival. I saw a sign one time that says, "Fish and friends both stink after 3 days." Maybe Jacob was aware that he was getting close to overstaying his welcome, and he began helping out, so not to be a burden to the family. And also, he still has to keep up appearances. No doubt that Rachel is around, so he stood a little straighter. He's flexed his arms when he's carrying something, no matter how light it was. He was trying hard to impress her, and maybe even to impress her father as well. And you know that Laban had to notice how much Jacob was in love with Rachel. He was just infatuated. It had to be obvious. And he also knew that if Jacob indeed is the son of Isaac, as he claims to be, he is going to be a very wealthy man. Even though Jacob showed up with only the clothes on his back, Laban saw potential gain from this situation. Laban always looks for a way to potential gain. He has always been a schemer. We saw that the last time when he tried to delay the servant of Abraham. Even Rebekah's mother had excuses for them to delay further. We saw that Rebekah was the one to conceive the plan of deceiving Isaac, and we saw her son Jacob play that role perfectly. So we have quite the family of con artists here. And Laban has had decades of experience under his belt now, so he's not going to fail this time. He will milk this situation for everything he can get. Legend has it that his descendants, the descendants of Laban, call our phones and message us online trying to scam people out of their money. Okay, I'm kidding. I think it could possibly be. Jacob has nothing to offer right now except for labor. But crafty old Laban knows that he has something that Jacob wants. He's been pulling his own weight. He's been earning his own room and board the whole time. But it's time to step that up a notch. Laban says in verse 15, "Because you are my relative, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what will your wages be?" Now, you might think this was nice of him to let Jacob set his wages. Wouldn't you like to have an employer say, "Well, how much do you want to make? Name your price." While it may seem as if Laban was giving him a blank check, Laban's actually given Jacob just enough rope to hang himself, if you will excuse the expression. It's no secret that Jacob is an impulsive man. He has been acting bold and heroic and doing everything he can ever since that encounter at the well. He knows that given the chance, Jacob will promise to do something bold and extravagant in exchange for Rachel. This boy is madly in love with her, which make men do things that they normally wouldn't do anyway and say extraordinary things. But you can imagine that if Rachel was around to hear it, Jacob's going to seize the opportunity to put an enormous price and declare the value of his potential bride. Sure enough, Jacob takes the bait from Laban, and he declares in verse 18, "I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel." Did you hear that, Rachel? You're worth 7 years of labor. Knowing what we know about Laban, Jacob should have started out lower. Laban was going to change the terms one way or another, but Jacob started high. 7 years of hard labor. He wanted Rachel to know just how much he loved her. Before that happened, though, Scripture put 2 verses in between the question and the answer to let us know that Laban has another daughter who is older. If you're familiar with Genesis, you know where this is going. This is to let us know the context of the deception that Laban is going to pull at the end of the 7 years. It also gives us a description of the 2 girls that is more of a comparison of the 2 than really a description. And we will come back to those verses in the second half of this chapter and discuss what those descriptions really meant and why they were important enough to be recorded in Scripture. While that is a very important passage, the focus right here is the transaction between Jacob and Laban. So if you come here wanting to know of this about, Leah's eyes were weak and all of this stuff, we'll get to that in the next half of this chapter and also in chapter 30. We're going to focus on these 2 ladies and give them their time in the spotlight because the description given here has much to do with how they're treated and how they're going to react to the events that are to come. So I promise we'll come back and dig into verses 16 and 17 next time. But right here, Jacob states his terms. 7 years of labor for Rachel's hand in marriage. Plain and clear. Jacob has actually given up his deceptive ways for now. He's playing straight with Laban. This is how serious he is about his love for Rachel. He wants to do this the right way. He doesn't want to mess up. Jacob is being honorable. Jacob may have a wealthy family at home, but he's got nothing to his name in this land. Nothing to offer as a dowry. Nothing to prove that he was capable of supporting her. So he offers 7 years of hard, faithful labor to prove his ability that he would be a good provider for Rachel. Laban, however, has the wheels and gears of his diabolical mind turning. He's trying to find a way to take advantage of this situation. Did you notice his answer in Genesis 29:19? Laban said, "It is better that I give her to you than to give her to another man. Stay with me." This should have been in a written, signed, and witnessed contract, and I bet Jacob never falls for this again. Sometimes in a contract, there's fine print buried somewhere inside that long thing called terms and conditions. Not very many people ever read those completely, do they? They just scroll right over it and click the box and sign next to the line. In a verbal agreement, the deal is only as honorable as the people that are making it. That means this transaction here is doomed from the start. Also, in a verbal agreement, there's still fine print that contains loopholes. You just have to be paying attention. Read everything on any contract that you sign. So one more time, looking at verse 19, try to find the loophole in this fine print. Laban said, "It is better that I give her to you than to give her to another man. Stay with me." Did you see Laban agree to that anywhere? Laban did not agree with the deal. He did not promise to give Rachel as agreed. He simply stated, well, it's better to give her to you than to someone else. The older deceiver just got one over on the younger deceiver, and Jacob fell for it, hook, line, and sinker, as they say. And in verse 20, we see he'll spend the next 7 years completely oblivious to the fact that he is being used. that he's being taken advantage of. It said the years just flew by quickly because of his love for her. Warren Wiersbe says happiness consists of having someone to love, something to do, and something to look forward to. And Jacob had all three: someone to love, something to do, and something to look forward to. And up until this verse, Jacob has done everything right. He trusts Laban. He makes a generous offer, but the consequences of his deception in the past are about to come back and bite him in the rear. When we come back to the text next time, we're going to go into detail about the description of these two daughters and try to see how they are affected by the schemes of their own father. Nobody ever discusses how they must have felt about this. Nobody ever seems to care about their feelings, and having studied ahead in preparation for next time, I have come to appreciate Leah much more than I have in previous studies. In fact, you might even start to like her more than Rachel by the time we are done with these two. But for now, Laban, he's just sitting back, he's smiling and enjoying the knowledge that he is not done getting work out of his nephew yet. He has come to the conclusion that women are just property to be traded off as financial gain. He profited from marrying off his sister, and now he has not just one daughter, but two that he can make a profit off of. He thinks if he ever needs money, or if he's tired of putting up with someone, just send them to the well and hope that a stranger comes by and wants them. While he pulls the wool over Jacob's eyes and he makes a quick buck bargaining away people that are supposed to be loved ones, he is also stacking up his own pile of consequences that are guaranteed to return to him in due time. As the Bible says, be assured your sin will find you out.